Hey class, let's jump into Paul's theology for the second video of this week. We're going to discuss it through two things. One, understanding where scholarship is right now on Paul. And then secondly, we're going to give a quick overview of Romans just so you can kind of see Paul's theology in action and how it works in one of his later books. Now, before we begin, I want to talk about the way that Paul is normally interpreted. The way Paul is generally interpreted, I would say, in a lot of churches, the way I was raised, probably understanding Paul, just so you kind of get an understanding of where we are. So this is what we might call the old perspective on Paul. And it understands Paul primarily through legal imagery, right? Through law, through legal imagery. And this old perspective goes something like this, right? The Jewish religion was ultimately about law and works, right? It was all about pleasing God through the law. But the problem is that ultimately we cannot please God, right? Because we are sinners. We are awful sinners that cannot please God. So ultimately the law did us no good, right? The Judaism ultimately did us no good. But then Jesus comes and he's full of grace, right? And he takes away the guilt. He takes away the legal penalty for our sins, and he pardons us through his sacrifice, right? So what ultimately ends up happening here is that Jesus is all about grace, all about goodness, and then Judaism becomes seen as a works righteousness religion, right? Judaism becomes all about works righteousness. So in this old perspective, it assumes two things that you'll need to know. That one, that Jesus is ultimately the cancellation or the overcoming of works righteousness found in Judaism, right? That Judaism is all about works righteousness, but Jesus overcomes that. And secondly, it understands Jesus primarily through legal imagery, right? That Jesus' main work, especially on the cross, was that he set us free from our guilt, right? That we no longer have to be punished for our sin. And that's the old perspective, and that's not the perspective that this class will assume. The problem is with that, as I see it, is that it's not really in Paul. I don't see this argument being made by Paul ever. For one, an easy way to see this is that Paul never really uses the word guilt or guilty, right? He just never uses it. It's not really in there. He doesn't talk about our guilt hardly at all, if honestly. It's not a central part to his argument for sure. And the second piece is that the Jewish people did not understand their religion as a works righteousness religion. They understood it as a covenant, grace-filled religion. And Paul does not have a whole lot of negative things to say about Judaism as a whole. In fact, he continues to practice it. He continues to be a Jew. Now, we will see he argues against specific parts of it, but he does not argue against Judaism as a whole. So that's the old perspective and my problems with it. Here's the new perspective and the way I understand Paul, and the way most modern scholars understand Paul, and the way this class will ultimately understand Paul. So it'll be important to know. And about 50 years ago, I guess now, there was a scholar named E.P. Sanders, and he demonstrated by looking at Jewish sources and understanding Judaism in the first century that Judaism was a covenant-based religion and not a works righteousness-based religion. They did not see themselves as a works righteousness-based religion, and neither did Paul, right? And so in light of this discovery, this scholar argued that Paul did not see the Jewish religion as a rules-based works righteousness religion that Jesus overcome, right? Instead, Paul saw Christianity as a continuation of and reimagination of the grace-filled promises of God in the Old Testament, right? So Paul did not see this division like I think sometimes we say he did between the Old Testament and New Testament. He sees the New Testament and Jesus particularly as a continuation. And so here's the deal. The new perspective that we are going to talk about in this class is ultimately a refreshed understanding of Judaism, and in light of that, it is a refreshed understanding of Paul. Might be somewhere for you to write that down. Could possibly be there, right? So it's a refreshed understanding of Paul. So let's jump in and see what that refreshed understanding is, right? It's one that Paul believes that Jesus is the fulfillment, not the cancellation of, Jewish hopes and promises, right? Romans 1:2 says this: God promised this good news about his son ahead of time through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures. And he says that the son, Jesus, was ultimately descended from David, right? Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, right? Of what they were looking forward to. What were they looking forward to? To a day when God would intervene and change the whole world, right? We've seen that in the prophets and the apocalyptic imagery, right? That God would one day step in and change things, that there would be a Davidic king to take over, and he would change everything. Paul understands Jesus to be that Davidic king, right? That would take over and change everything. And so what was Paul ultimately arguing about when he talked about, when he's talking about people with the Jewish religion, circumcision, which you're going to see? Paul was not arguing against the Jewish religion as a whole. Paul was ultimately arguing against certain Jews, which he calls Judaizers, right, that believed that because of their following the law, they were superior to the Gentiles. Now, they were special people, yes, but they were not superior. God never says that they were superior to other people. But some people began thinking that within the Jewish religion, saying, hey, because of our circumcision, because of all that we've gone through, I mean, be honest, if you went through circumcision, I guess you'd want some sort of good justification and feel righteous about it. But they say, hey, look, we are better than them because we follow the law. And Paul says, no, that's not part of the Jewish religion. You are misunderstanding the God of the Old Testament. You're not better than anyone. So that's who Paul is arguing against. He's never arguing against the whole Jewish religion. Okay? So what was the significance then of Jesus for Paul? What did Jesus do that was so important? And this comes to this idea, where the old perspective, as I talked about earlier, talked about the legal imagery in Paul. The new perspective, and the perspective I understand, ultimately understands Paul and Jesus through relational imagery, right? So what Jesus did for Paul was that his death and resurrection overcame the power of sin. Okay, so good so far. Which brings me back to what we talked about earlier in this class, that sin is not about breaking a law. Sin is about breaking relationship. Sin is a relational term. So what Jesus did on the cross, as we celebrated this weekend, is he took on our sin, right? And when he took on our sin, he took on all that hatred that humanity has for each other, right? All the hatred, all the evil things we've done to each other, Jesus took that on in himself, right? He took that on in the cross. And then Jesus ultimately, through the cross, through the resurrection, overcame that sin, overcame the divisions that destroys relationships. He came back around. Ephesians 2:14 says this, "For he is our peace," Jesus. "In his flesh he made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is the hostility between us." Right? It says right there, what Jesus has done is he's broken down the walls between different people groups. Those divisions we've talked about by ethnicity, race, socioeconomics, social status, all of those things have been broken down by Jesus. In Galatians 3, Jesus is going to say, or Paul is going to argue that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, right? Male or female, all are one in Jesus Christ. So Jesus has just taken on the sin that ultimately divides us, one from God and two from each other, and he's taken that in and he's defeated it. So there's no longer a dividing wall between us and God, and there's no longer a dividing wall between us and the rest of humanity, right? He's made all one in Jesus. So ultimately, new relationships can be formed in Jesus. And so the new perspective, which this class assumes, and we will be talking about at least this week, argues two things. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures, right? He is the continuation of it. Jesus does not cancel or undo the Old Testament, any part of it. Jesus even says this, right? He doesn't do that. And secondly, that Jesus' death overcame the sin that divides humanity from God and the sin that divides humanity from each other. And therefore, he created a new humanity where former boundaries no longer separate us, right? There is a new humanity where those old boundaries no longer separate us and new relationships can be formed. Okay, let's jump into the book of Romans and talk about how Paul's theology happens on the ground. The book of Romans was written to a church that was divided, specifically a church that was divided between Jews and Gentiles. There's a great division going on. There's infighting, all kinds of crazy stuff. So Paul ultimately writes in order to help them get along, right? Paul here is not necessarily writing to give the plan of salvation or anything like that sometimes people say. Paul is writing to help two groups who are fighting with each other to reconcile, to get back together, okay? So how does Paul do this? He does it through four parts. There's four sections to his argument in Romans. And we're going to go through each of those three. The first three are what I call theological, where he's talking about what God has done. And then the last part is the ethical, saying, hey, since God has done this, you need to go do this in light of that. Okay? So 1 through 4 is the first section, Romans 1 through 4. And I call this section one family. He's saying, look, because of sin, Jews and Gentiles were divided. There was divisions among us, right? And I can, if you want more details on how this works, I can give it to you, but I'm giving you the real short version. They were divided. Remember, sin breaks our relationship and divides us. So we were divided. We were broken, right? Because of sin. But God promised ultimately to Abraham that he was going to bless the whole world and create one new humanity, create one new world, one new family through him. You can see these promises in Genesis. He says, I'll bless the whole world through you. And Paul is arguing, look, God has been faithful to that promise. Why? Because now we see even Gentiles are being brought into the family of Abraham, right? So Jews and Gentiles are now one family who both look to Abraham as their father, right? Father Abraham had many sons, as I sang in when I was a small child, right? So there's one family. He says, okay, then he goes to section 2, which is Romans 5 through 8. And he argues here, look, even though we're one family, we are still under the power of sin. But Jesus has ultimately freed us from that. If you look in 5:14, 7:21, he says, look, humanity was under the power of sin. Nothing we could do about it. And that sin ultimately leads us to death. The wages of sin is death. That's what sin is going to lead us to, is death. But ultimately, Jesus has overcome all those great powers of sin, all those powers of death. Jesus has overcome them and ultimately created new life for his one family in God, right? You can see this in 5:15 and 8:37 has an outline there. He says, look, Jesus has overcome death, overcome our sin, and created a new humanity where new relationships can be formed. We can live according to the Spirit, which living according to the Spirit means getting along with each other, instead of by the flesh, which means acting selfishly and not getting along, right? So that's his whole argument, 5 through 8. Jesus has overcome the powers of sin and created new life for everyone, both Jew and Gentile, who are all in the family of Abraham. Chapters 9 through 11 is a little aside where he says, well, what's so important about Israel then? If we're all now under one family, if we're now all grafted into these promises, what's so important about Israel? Well, Paul has a few answers for that. He says, 1, the promises, the covenants, and even Christ himself all come through Israel. See, they were still God's chosen people. They were still special. They weren't superior, but they were special. He says, look, it all came through them. So of course we have to understand this. He said, now, some of Israel did reject Christ. They did reject Christ by believing they were superior. They did reject him. He says, I can't say anything about that. But ultimately, though, God will still have grace on them because they are God's people. God will still work with them because God has chosen them already. And he says, God will still have grace on all of Israel. There's still going to be grace. God is still working with Israel. God has not abandoned Israel. God is still working with them because, again, they're still God's chosen people. So this doesn't mean that now, and again, this goes back to my earlier point, this doesn't mean that the Old Testament, the law, and all that stuff has been done away with. Paul explicitly argues that here. He says, look, that stuff still is meaningful, it's powerful. Jesus didn't do away with it. In fact, God is still working with them, dealing with the people of Israel. There's still something special going on with them, okay? Which gets us to 12 through 16, which I think is what Paul is wanting to get to, and ultimately the main thrust of his argument. He says there, as a community, present yourselves as one sacrifice to God. So he says, look, all of you together, get together and work it out and make one sacrifice to God. He doesn't each one of you present yourselves a sacrifice. He says, I want one sacrifice. Learn to get together as a community and deal with this. He then says, don't think too highly of yourself. Don't think you're better than the next guy. Okay? Don't think you're better than anyone. And then finally, Romans 15:7 is Paul's main point in this letter. If you had to boil Romans down to one verse and what Paul is arguing, it's here. He says, look, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. He says, look, we are all one family. We have all been brought to life through Jesus, right? We're all in one boat together. Jesus has welcomed everyone, Jew and Gentile. Jesus has had grace on everyone, Jew and Gentile. So stop thinking so highly of yourself. Stop thinking you're better than someone else, and ultimately welcome one another. Get along. We're all in the same boat. We're all in one family, right? No one's better than another. So learn to get along. And so there you can see through these 4 parts how ultimately Paul uses theological language to address the issues going on in the Roman church. He says, look, get along. We are all saved by grace. We are all in one family in Jesus. So learn to get along. And that's ultimately Paul's argument in Romans, right? Get along. Jesus has welcomed you. Jesus had grace on all. So learn to have that same grace for each other and get along. Thanks, guys. That's the end of this one.